Hi there, Kim at Wild Hearts and Wildflowers, and today I want to share with you a nonfiction November reading update. Now, back in late October, when I announced my pile of possibilities, when I chose my 8 potential nonfiction November reads, I thought I might get to half of them. I didn't expect to get to all of them, and that is what's turning out to be the case. I've actually finished 3 of them. I've started a 4th. I've added 3 other nonfiction books, which were not amongst the original 8. And the other 4 original books, well, those are just going to carry over because I'm still very interested in reading them. Just don't have time to do it in November because, to be honest, I like reading lots of books, all different genres. And while nonfiction is one of my top genres, I have a lot of other things I like to read. So I did read some fiction in November too. So today I want to talk about the 2 nonfiction books I just finished, 1 I've just started, and the 3 that I added to my reading for this month and have finished as well. Starting with the books that I added in, which I did because I realized, well, I'm reading them and they're nonfiction, so they should count, right? So I mentioned one of these in my last reading update for Nonfiction November, and that is Rebecca Solnit's essay collection, The Mother of All Questions. So you can look back at my first update to hear what I originally thought about it. Now that I finished it, nothing has changed in that regard. That's because this was a reread. I'm very familiar with Rebecca Solnit's essays, and I'm actually going through a reread of all of her collections right now and branching out into her memoir and some of her nature writing, some of her conservation, ecological landscaping work, all very interesting. But The Mother of All Questions was great upon reread, as I knew it would be. Really, it's both reinvigorating and comforting to read her work after the recent election. One thing I noted after rereading this book this time was something I'd always meant to get to but had forgotten about, once I read it the first time through, and that is she talks quite a bit about a movie that was put out in 1956, won Best Director. I think it was nominated for 9 or 10 other awards that year. And that is Giant. And this is a movie based on Edna Ferber's book, Giant. Now, the reason that Rebecca Solnit brought up this movie is that it was set in the 1920s in Texas, rich rancher, and he marries this young woman, Leslie, who played by Elizabeth Taylor, who is quite a strong female character, one you wouldn't expect to see in the time period, which was the 1920s. And she stands in opposition to her husband, the wealthy rancher, and basically all of the Texans there in the ranching community against their anti-Mexican sentiments. A lot of prejudice, a lot of discrimination going on against the Mexican-American workers at that time. And she was really not going to have any of it. She stood up and spoke her mind about it, which was not something you really saw in the movies at that time. Or in the books at that time as Ferber wrote it. Now, what I'm going to say is going to be a little bit of a spoiler, so if you don't want to know anything about the story Giant, then you should, skip ahead a minute or so. Her husband in the movie very, very gradually comes around to agreeing with her, but you don't see it until the very end. From what I understand, in the book, Ferber does not have the husband, Bick, come around to his wife's views. They do love each other a lot. They do stay together. And because their son, when he grows up, actually marries a Mexican-American and presents them with a grandchild, he does have to adjust his views, but he never comes around to her way of thinking entirely. This is from what I understand from reading reviews. But the movie does portray her effect on him. More importantly, it shows her as an example of someone who, while certainly not, an activist for their cause, certainly an ally to them, who speaks up for them, helps them, and is not silenced by the males around her, the society around her, who thinks very differently than she does at that time period. Now, not by any stretch of imagination is this 1956 movie completely in line with the way we think about race and gender and such today. However, for being put out in 1956 and set in the 1920s, I find it pretty laudable and pretty encouraging and pretty interesting. In fact, another thing to note about this movie is that 3 of the male actors, the 2 leads and another significant role, were played by queer men. So Rock Hudson was gay, and both Sal Mineo and James Dean were self-admittedly bisexual. Now, this was something that wasn't usually talked about at that time period, but I definitely think it brings an added element to the movie. So I was surprised to find reference to this movie and book again in this collection. I had forgotten about it, and now both the book and the movie are on my list to get to very soon. So overall, I'm really glad I chose to add in Rebecca Solnit's essay collection to this month's reading, and I'm really looking forward to rereading all the rest of them in the months to come. The next 2 books that I added to my nonfiction reading for November were books of nature poetry, which I discussed in my last video all about nature poetry and conservation. So I won't talk about them here, I'll just show you them, and they are Mary Oliver's Why I Wake Early and Kai Siedenburg's Poems of Earth and Spirit. I really enjoyed both of these collections, and the way I like to read poetry is one in the morning and one in the evening, because that gives me plenty of time to ponder them, even if just in my subconscious, and I'm not rushing through them and missing things, missing the enjoyment of them along the way. Now, one of the books that was in my original pile of possibilities that I actually have finished is Natural Causes. Let me just read the subtitle for you because it's long but meaningful. An Epidemic of Wellness, the Certainty of Dying and Killing Ourselves to Live Longer. Now, Barbara Ehrenreich is a great writer, a journalist writer. She is also, though, as I mentioned in my first reading update when I was talking about the first few chapters of this book, she is also a cellular biologist. At least that is something she has a degree in. She went a different route with her life, like a lot of us do from our original, college level studies. But she is fascinated by science, and she knows a lot of stuff about science. So she understands the research she's reading, and when she interviews scientists, she understands what they're talking about. And so she brings that with her to her journalistic writing. However, she is mostly known for her sociological type of journalism, where she looks at current sociology trends in the country and the world. And so she's known for a lot of books that cover hard subjects, often subjects that people have very different opinions about, and this book is no different. So yes, the first chapters in her book are all about rituals of medicine, traditional medicine, in the sense of why it's been done the way it's been done, why maybe it should not be done the way it's always been done, some of the ridiculous practices that we are almost forced into, some of the very wasteful, both time-wise but mostly money-wise, practices, tests that are done on us that often lead to actually not just stress and worry, which we know can cause more illness, but actual aggravation or even causation of some disorders and diseases. As she's known for, she brings in a lot of proof by way of scientific research evidence, and she brings up a lot of example stories. Her narrative nonfiction is definitely entertaining, and I will say she has a somewhat snarky nature at times. This is very much evident in the beginning chapters of this book, and I think it goes with what she's talking about. And she's had the personal experience with this, so she's not just talking about things she's heard. I must admit, though, my favorite part of this book was the middle section. One of the chapters she entitles Cellular Treason. And you can tell she really knows what she's talking about here because of her past studies. And it is fascinating. She really gets into the nitty-gritty of the science and how our cells, which in the past we've been told, are there to protect us. And if one goes astray and starts dividing and becomes cancerous, this is a fluke. She brings up that actually science is proving that's not true. Science is showing us now that this is pretty common. This is a behavior many cells have, and we should expect it. and she explains it very well. And I didn't just find it fascinating, I found it eye-opening, and I'm going to read that whole middle section again. So I really cement that knowledge in my head and go look for other books, other scientific authors who write on this topic. She's really good about giving references, and so I will be looking in her bibliography for other writers I can read on this subject. The last part of this book was also very interesting, all about aging and why we should do it naturally, why we should not be fearing death, and what are some of the things we should think about before we get to the end of our lives about how we want to approach aging, what we don't want to find ourselves sucked into, and how we want to approach death itself. There are many good books on this topic, but I feel like the ending chapters of this book are a good lead-in, a good intro to some of those other more detailed books. One of the ones I will be reading in the near future is Being Mortal. And I'm going to be looking for other books on this subject too. If you know of any really good ones, please put them in the comments below, because I want to read more about this. I'm very much for natural aging, and I'm very much against prolonging my life unnaturally at the expense of, well, joyful living, comfortable living, and at the expense of my family. So, yeah, I need to do this now because I'm not getting any younger. Neither are you, by the way. Now, the other book I finished reading so far for NonFiction November is, I'd have to say, my favorite of the month at this point. And that is The Possibility of Life, Science, Imagination, and Our Quest for Kinship in the Cosmos by Jaime Green. Now, I believe that in my first reading update, I called Jaime Green a journalist, and that is not actually technically correct. She does write articles for a wide variety of magazines, but she's actually known to be a very reputable and interesting science writer. And boy, did I find that to be true. She writes a very entertaining book, but a very well-researched book. And because she is a science writer and has a lot of experience talking to scientists, she brings in lots of up-to-date scientific research that is really relevant to what she's discussing. Now, this book has 6 chapters in it. It's not a long read. It's about, 272 pages with an extensive bibliography after that. So not long. And the 6 chapters are origins, planets, animals, people, technology, and contact. While this is a very well-researched book, it is mostly entertaining and thought-provoking. It asks so many great questions that are not usually asked in this type of book. At least I haven't found it to be the case. And the main questions seem to be centered on, what are we really as humans? And what are we really looking for out there? And as we push forward with space exploration, or as we wish to push forward, as we hope and dream of exploring farther and farther outward, what are we hoping to find? Will we even recognize it when we find it? I really enjoyed the fact that this book is chock full of references, quotes, and whole scenes from much beloved science fiction books, both old and new. I remember her talking about Aunt Beast from A Wrinkle in Time, but many other books as well. And TV shows like Star Trek, movies like Arrival. I don't want to name any more because I want them to be surprises for you if you read it. But if you have read science fiction, watched TV shows dealing with science fiction, or any of the great science fiction movies that have come out in the 20th and 21st centuries, you will find much familiar ground here. And the way she connects those things to the concepts, the questions that she is tackling here is incredibly interesting, and also makes the reading so addictive. You just want to keep reading more. I don't want to give the impression, though, that it's a pop science book totally, because it really can't be classified as just that with the amount of scientific research that she's brought up in it. Really, it's both a springboard toward more study in this area if you want to go that way, or just a book that will let you sit back, get cozy, reminisce about all the great science fiction you've consumed in many different formats through the years, and also let you think about what if? How would that really work? Could it? Will we ever know? Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, I highly suggest you pick up Jaime Green's book. I'm actually going to be looking for some copies to give as gifts to some of my kids who love this kind of thing. Now, as to the one other book from my original pile of possibilities that I do want to read in November, got 6 days left? It's this one, Woman Captain Rebel. The extraordinary true story of a daring Icelandic sea captain by Margaret Willson. Now, this book is 320 pages, not counting the extensive bibliography, the reader's study guide with great questions at the back, and the fact that she includes very detailed footnotes for each chapter. This book was so well researched. I found it absolutely unputdownable. It did take me a little while to get hooked into it, not because of the story. The premise is fantastic. Let me read the back to you. Every day was a fight for survival, equality, and justice for Iceland's most renowned female fishing captain of the 19th century. History would have us believe the sea's always been a male realm, the idea of female captains almost unthinkable. But Captain Thurder is the exception, so notable she defies any expectation. She became an acclaimed fishing captain, brilliant at weather reading and seacraft, and consistently bringing in large catches. In the Arctic seas, where drownings occurred with terrifying regularity, she never lost a single crew member. Renowned for her acute powers of observation, she also solved a notorious crime. In this extremely unequal society, she used the courts to fight for justice for the abused, and in her 60s, she embarked on perilous journeys over trackless mountains. Yeah, the premise was not the problem. The story didn't need to hook me, but it's just so well researched. There's so much detail here. You have to be reading carefully. Also, it's set in Iceland, and the names of the places and people are a bit difficult to get used to, a little confusing. Now, Willson does a great job of giving you pronunciation guides, of giving nicknames to some of the people because so many of their names are similar, of giving you a map so you can visualize where this is all taking place. So it wasn't long before I was enthralled and, like I said, couldn't put it down. Very good story of someone history is sort of forgotten about and yet definitely shouldn't have. So I'm already about in chapter 5? Yeah, chapter 5. And I am sure I will finish it this month. And I look forward to telling you more about it in December when I do my NonFiction November wrap up, where I will cover everything I read in November for this group project. I hope you read at least 1 or 2 good nonfiction books this last month, and I would love to hear about them in the comments below. I just really enjoy hearing what people thought of books, what their big takeaway was, and if I happen to get a great book recommendation out of it, that makes it even all the better. And of course, even though Nonfiction November is drawing to an end, we can all continue to read nonfiction throughout the year. I know I will. After all, there is an unending supply of amazing topics to learn about and intriguing stories to read and enjoy, and it's all just waiting there for us. So I do intend to keep reading nonfiction all year. I have lots here on my shelves, and there's always more available at the library. And of course, new titles coming out all the time. But fiction is also good. And so I'll be talking about some fiction books I read in November pretty soon too. Until next time, I wish you all some happy reading this last week of November.